So good afternoon and welcome. My name is Andrea Sampson, and I'll be your host and guide as we delve deeply into the issues that are impacting us all on today's episode of Sense Making Conversations. Now, I love history. It helps me to understand our language, to contextualize our culture, and to make sense of the ways in which we choose to behave and how we act now and in the future. When I think about the history of North America, there's a real separation between those who are indigenous to this land and those who settled here from the European heritage. And interactions between these two groups have been marked with violence and bigotry and tragedy that just truly hurts my heart to even think about. But how can we learn from our past and make better decisions as we recreate our society today? As I think about that history, the history of my European based ancestors and the indigenous people of North America, it's no surprise that there's a real cultural mindset difference. Europeans are really individualistic in nature, and the indigenous peoples are much more collectivist. But what does that even mean, individualist versus collectivist? Well, according to authors Nesbitt and Ping in a research report that they did in 2000, they say that cultures with individualistic tendencies tend to have an analytic, decontextualizing cognitive orientation. They speak in third person. They prioritize the individual over the group. They emphasize independence, competition, and individual achievement. Well, that sounds a whole lot like the world we live in today, right? But what about that collectivist approach? So they go on to say that those with collectivist tendencies have holistic, contextualizing cognitive orientations, speaking in the first person. They place greater value on the welfare of the group rather than on the individual. They fit in, they collaborate, and they have a fulfillment of expected roles, which are emphasized. Individuals come to view themselves as part of a larger construct, interdependent rather than independent. Huh. That's a really different way of thinking of things. And some of us might say, yeah, that's the way I'd love to live. And others might say, that's really triggering to me. I can't imagine living in a world like that. But the reality is the individualistic approach has played out really well in our modern society. I mean, if you think of the ways in which we make decisions and the way in which we act, it is very individualistic. But what about incorporating collectivism into it? Is there one way or another, or is there some way to incorporate both? I actually don't know. But when we look at our system today, whether it be our democratic system, our culture, our capital markets, they are very, very individualistic. But we are in a time of great change, a time where many of us are rethinking how we're choosing to live, to interact, and to work. And from this place, we can choose to learn and to listen and to observe. I mean, the reality is the indigenous people of North America have practiced forms of collectivism for over a millennia. Maybe we have something we could learn. This is the conversation that we're beginning today with my guest, Tim Coldwell, a husband, dad, and Indigenous entrepreneur focused on leading by serving, observing culture, and the monetization of ideas. He serves as president of Chandos, an an employee-owned national technical builder that is leading change in the Canadian construction industry. Chandos is proud to be the first and largest B Corp certified commercial general contractor in North America. Tim believes that businesses can generate economic value while still creating value for society by addressing its challenges. Under Tim's leadership, Chandos has formed partnerships with social enterprises across Canada, focusing on employment of at-risk youth and those who are underrepresented in the construction industry. Tim is an advisor to San Francisco's Center for Innovation in the design and construction industry, and he's been named to the top 40 under 40 list and is an alumnus of the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference. Welcome, Tim. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
That's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Andrea.
But Tim, let's start off. You and I have known each other for a few years now, and I know that you've got a bit of a um, of a past that is a little unconventional, and you came to your Indigenous heritage maybe a little bit later than some. Tell me how that happened.
Yeah, so I'm status Mohawk from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, Tandanaga Mohawk territory on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. But I didn't grow up in the community. I actually learned that I had status or was given status with Bill C-31 in 1985. So I would have been 4 or 5 years old or something like that at the time. And so I grew up in a very kind of conservative religious kind of an upbringing. My father's an independent fundamental minister, and I was taught to fear people that were different than me. And I was also taught that indigenous ways of being were pagan and to be assimilated by, call it, white culture. And so that was the context of my upbringing. And there's a much longer story to it, but suffice it to say that when I was about 15 or so, I started to really question that line of thought. And my saving grace is my mother taught me to read at a very high level at a very young age. And I was into the big classics and Plato and Dostoevsky and Immanuel Kant and that kind of stuff. And it teaches you kind of how to think. And it opened up my mind to the value of an education. And I learned that if I applied myself and studied hard, that I could get a full scholarship to go to university in Canada, and that the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte would fund that scholarship. And I had to have something like a 89% average or something in high school, and I had never set foot in a high school. And so I did distance learning with a tutor. I was working part-time in a lumber mill, and I did distance learning with a tutor, and I got the grades that I needed in order to qualify for the scholarship. And I remember I got the letter from Ron Maricles, the chief in Mohawks the Bay of Quinte, and that was my ticket to go to university. And shortly after that, right around the same point in time, I got a job at Chandos. And I didn't have the best experience. I didn't have the best grades, but Chandos gave me a chance. And I found a second family and a sense of purpose in the organization. It's driven me over the years. And so, for the first few years of university and getting out and into the world and public life, I was like, literally like a feral animal from the bush kind of a thing. And you want to talk about culture shock. I didn't really have mental bandwidth to get reconnected. But as I kind of got more stable, I would say there was like this gravity that pulled me back to my Indigenous heritage. And I started to do research and started to learn a lot about it. It's been an amazing journey. And I've just been struck with the parallels between millennia old Indigenous ways of being and the parallels that I want to function as a business leader. And it's just a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to having it.
Yeah, and just as I listen to you, like there's a lot that you just went through. So, it sounds like you were homeschooled.
Yep.
And that, so you started off in a very conservative family, and a family, from the sounds of it, viewed your own cultural background as something that was taboo in many ways.
Yep.
And so you grew up with this belief that who you were at your core, even though that may not have been true for you, like it was something to be reviled in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then, the irony of it, you grow up and you end up being sent to school to learn by the very people who you were taught to, in some ways, disassociate with.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really incredible, right? Like, wow, you came back into this world. And so I'm curious, like when you applied to the Mohawks at the Bay of Quinte for the scholarship, what was it like at that point? Were you embracing your own Indigenous heritage, or was it still something that you were kind of going, well, I'm not really going to tell anyone about it, but if this works, this will be good?
Yeah, I would say my inside voice and, like the real me was starting to embrace and was really curious. Like there's this
Yeah.
gravity that pulls you back.
Yeah.
But the outside voice didn't line up with it early days. And it took a couple years to get comfortable with that. And yeah, it's just amazing how that kind of happens in life.
It is funny, And so, even as I listen to that, like, I go back to that idea of collectivism versus individualism. And, it sounds like, you grew up in a culture where being homeschooled, it's very individualistic, right? You don't have a lot of social interaction.
Mhm.
And so, and then coming into this world and learning of your own Indigenous roots, of what it meant to have Indigenous roots, and how you could sort of look at the world maybe through different eyes. How has that started to shape as you think about this from where you are now? You're a leader in business. You've done some amazing things in the world, and you lead an organization that is helping in many ways. And so how do you see that concept of collectivism and your own Indigenous heritage of collectivism has shaped you as a leader?
Yeah, I guess, pop psychology, get me on the couch here for a second. But I think, if you teach your kid your whole life to do X, you're almost guaranteed with certain kinds of kids that they'll do the opposite. And so I grew up in this world where it was very individualistic. It was us against them. It was everyone else was to be feared. We want to hang out with people who are the same as us. It was all of that. And I think what's really defined my business career is to do the opposite of that. So I've always sought out people who are different from me because I'm curious and I want to learn, and I recognize the value of a different perspective. And so that's been something that I've done. And so maybe there's been this kind of tendency towards collectivism because I grew up in a world that was very individualistic. And yeah, I that's probably what it is. And just from a default, let's call it like a personality for me, I always think it's better to do things together. And like there's no I in business. There is no, it's we, and we do it together. And everything about leadership is about making other people powerful, and it's about the people who follow. And so you learn that pretty quick. And when it's about you, it just doesn't work. And so I've just been very interested in the idea of making it about us in everything. And yeah, I don't know if that comes from the upbringing. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's just a freak of my personality, but that's just how it's worked.
Well, and I do wonder, we are more than just what we're taught, there's the nurture versus nature. I mean, and
Hmm.
so I wonder, as you think about, and I remember when you and I were chatting a few weeks ago, you told me a story about you taking a family trip in the Bay of Quinte, I believe it was.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, and I think there was something really beautiful there about you sort of like experiencing your own Mohawk heritage in a way that suddenly connected the physical, sort of this physical form with this history that
Yeah.
just seemed to come rushing
Yeah,
back. Tell us a
yeah,
little bit about that.
well, there's a couple pieces to it. So I was born in Western Canada, and I spent most of my adult life in Western Canada. I moved to Toronto about 3 years ago. And moving to Ontario, in a sense, is like coming home. Chandos, our organization, is actually named after a lake in Ontario, so it's a very Canadiana sort of a thing. And then the Mohawk or Eastern Woodlands peoples. And so I, go for a hike, and you've got these towering hardwood forests in Ontario. That's kind of a foreign concept to me because I grew up in the prairies. And you stand in there, and there's almost this kind of spiritual sort of a sense. And, it's the place of our ancestors for millennia, sort of a thing. So that's kind of a powerful concept. And then just more directly, as I learned about my heritage, I'm the great, 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 great. I lost track of how many greats there are, but grandson of a guy named John Deseronton. And John Deseronton was a Mohawk war chief and a contemporary of Joseph Brant in upstate New York. And they fought with the British against the Americans in the US War for Independence. The US won. And so the Mohawk got pushed up into Quebec and into Ontario. And so the families that followed Joseph Brant settled around Brantford and Six Nations in Ontario. And the families that followed John Deseranton, my great 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 grandfather, settled at the Bay of Quinte. And so that's kind of the connection. And when you go to the Bay of Quinte, there's this island that's off the mainland. It's called Captain John's Island. And it belonged at one point to my great 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 grandfather. And so our family did a little bit of a boat vacation last year and went through the Trent Canal and down through there and actually went out there and took our boat and beached it on the island. And so I actually stood on the island that's opposite the mainland, and just you get a sense of place and heritage that comes from that. So it was really, really meaningful adventure.
Mm-hmm. And so that connection, as you have learned about your Indigenous culture, um, you know, what do you take away now, and how are you parenting your children differently because of what you've become to learn about this deep and rich culture that you weren't really allowed to be a part of as a child?
Yeah, I think, there's kind of these, I guess the best way of coming at it is to really come at it from a uh, embedding in the kids. I've got two daughters, two little girls, 5 and 8. Kind of this sense that it's not all about here and now, and that it's about what you leave for future generations. I think that's probably the best way I have of describing the sort of values that we talk about with the kids. And then yeah, and so that's like a respect for nature. There's a whole conversation about the planet and being sustainable. There's all sorts of things that come out of that conversation. um, and once again, back to the leadership piece about, it's not about me, it's about us. And those two things, kind of a long-term view and a collective, what is the collective good, I think, are the two main things that I really focus on.
And do you bring that into your work? Like, how does that actually come into your work as well?
Yeah, so for sure. And I think part of, you got to keep in mind that Chandos is to an extent like a second family for me, right? And so Chandos was 100% employee owned before I joined the organization. We already had a strong focus on corporate social responsibility, those sorts of things. But when it's an employee owned business, it's not my business. Yes, I run around with the president's business card, but it's our business. And in fact, in Chandos, less than 30% of the equity or the control of the company is controlled by C-suites, executives. So we very much work for the people who are doing the work, carpenters and laborers, project managers, estimators, and PMs. That's a totally different environment than most construction companies. Most construction companies are owned by a couple of middle-aged white guys, frankly, or a family, and they control all the equity and they give the bare minimum ownership to the people who are doing the work. We're the exact opposite of that. And so I think there's a parallel to the Indigenous world. Our whole commitment around being a B Corp and using that as the ultimate evidence that we walk the talk. That has all sorts of things around employee ownership that's baked into it, a collective approach. We've made a commitment to zero carbon by 2025. So stewardship of the planet is very much embedded in B Corp. That's about half of the scoring criteria. So, there's all those sorts of things. And I guess the last piece, we're leaders in North America in a delivery method called integrated project delivery. And it's the idea of getting everyone together around the project. So it's not just our project. It's not just my project. It's our project. And with the subcontractors who are doing the work, the architects and engineers who are doing the work, the owner that's paying everybody, and even carpenters and laborers and plumbers and electricians, it's a great mechanism to get communities involved in the project. And so, yeah, that's how this kind of a collectivist worldview gets expressed in our business for sure.
But as I listened to you, because it was very different, right? Like the way what you just described. I mean, I've spent close to 30 years working in corporate Canada, and the reality is that yes, we have projects, of course, and there are project teams, but it's not looked at as a collectivist approach. There's usually
Mm,
one person who's responsible. They're the taskmaster to drive us all to get the job done, and somebody gets the award for having achieved whatever it was, the thing that we achieved. Yes, there's a sense of team, but there's also a sense of there's a leader of that team. And
mhm.
the way that you just described it, it was much more of a community of workers, people who come together. And it sounds like, sure, there are at different times different leaders, but but within that, you're all working together on that.
Yeah.
And so I think that is very different. And I think it's a really interesting thing. Like, I wonder, is there a way to get that out into the world more broadly? I mean, is that part of being a B Corp? Is that part of the way in which, I mean, it sounds like Chandos was always that way. That's not a new thing for you.
Yep.
But, is the B Corp status something that maybe can help others learn how to do that?
Yeah, for sure. I think there is a, dare I say, tidal wave of medium to large businesses now who are pushing back against, like, call it the global multinational, faceless, soulless organization. And people want to express their personal purpose through their work. And they want their work to make a difference and have an impact. And so, in my view, the B Corp certification is the single best mechanism that you can use to move in that direction. Like, you manage what you measure. And
Yeah.
so once you start that journey, it's just amazing the impact it has in organizations. And the movement, I did a speaking thing with one of the founders of B Labs a couple months ago, and they're seeing exponential growth in companies registering to be B Corps. And I just
Yeah.
don't think you put that genie back in the bottle now. There's a whole generation of younger, I sound like an old guy saying this, but a younger generation who really want to have purpose and meaning in their work. And they want that. And that's what the job market demands. That's what our customers want. That's what our employees want. I just think that's where the world's going. And I think that's a great platform for spreading it. One other thing that I would just say that kind of relates a bit to this, I didn't really realize this, but it's kind of come into focus more recently, a few years ago, I guess, more recently for me. Um, the capitalistic colonial sort of worldview is about the accumulation of wealth, and I win and you lose. And that's how people have for many 150 years kept score, I guess. In an Indigenous worldview, the idea of ownership is a different concept. And so it's the community that owns it.
Right.
And if you want to achieve prestige in the community, you give your wealth away. That's the whole idea on the West Coast of the
Yeah.
potluck. Um,
Right. Of
and
course.
so that is a very foreign concept to a lot of people. And I think that starts to be at the core of this. Like, fundamentally, you choose if you're going to share or you're not going to share. And what kind of person do you want to be, I guess, is the conversation.
Yeah. And I think I love the idea that B Corp is the way in which people can start to begin to explore their own passion and purpose through business, right?
Mm,
I agree with you. I think there's so much there in terms of where we're going, and the need to have purpose in what we do and the need to make a difference. And we're seeing that. Like, I think, in my opening remarks, I talked about the fact that, as a society, we've lived in this individualistic way, but it hasn't really, it's not working out that well for us. I mean, there
yeah.
are some things about it that maybe are great for some people, but for the collective, it's not so great.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to see some movement towards this collectivism. And I just wonder, is there the opportunity for us to come together into something that, because I don't know that we can swing from where we are all the way over into something else so quickly. But what's the path through? Like, in your opinion, just as you think about it, is there something that we can get? Is there a middle ground that we can get to it? And B Corp, yes, but is there a way through it
Yeah.
that helps us?
To me, if you want to really focus in on the business world, I think the single best way to get a collective approach in the business is to explore employee ownership. So in the UK, there is a whole push towards employee ownerships. In the US, there's an ESOP tax vehicle to encourage employee ownership in succession events. And now in Canada, that conversation is happening. So the largest transfer of wealth in human history is happening in the next 10 years. You got all these baby boomers who made a ton of cash and it's parked in these businesses that they and their families own. And they've got to figure out if they can get their cash out, go lay on a beach, or they're going to sell it to the employees. So you could sell to the big multinational, they'll take a multiple, you'll have golden handcuffs for a little bit and off you go, or you could sell it to your employees. And so I'm very interested in the idea of government policy that encourages an option to sell to the employees, because all of a sudden you're reversing the concentration of wealth in the few and you're spreading it out to the many, and you're encouraging the many to be part of decision making in the businesses. And that's how you get a collective approach. One thing I should say, people hear me talk about this, and our competitors, I hear this through backstories, but our competitors will somewhat derisively refer to us as the Socialist Republic of Chandos, and we've expanded across the country and opened offices, and they refer to that as the Imperial March of Chandos, and I think that's funny. What I would say that, with all of this kind of a collective approach, what I'm talking about, we remain a highly competitive, entrepreneurial, very, very scrappy organization. And we like making money and we make a lot of margin. And so you might hear, Chandos is soft. They're not going to make as much money as someone who's not. I would put our financials up against the sharpest sharks that are out there. And I think we make just as much, if not more money. And my data point on that is the construction industry is unique in that we provide bonding for our customers. And so there's like 3 or 4 bonding companies in Canada that see the financial statements of all the biggest contractors in Canada, and they tell us how we stack up against them. And we're near the top. And I'm proud about that. You can have both things.
Yeah. And I think this is, doing good to do, or does it do well to do good, or something, that I never get it quite right. But it's that idea that you don't have to, I see a little face joining us. You don't have to actually be highly competitive, sorry, you don't have to be highly individualistic in order to make money, right? Like there's nothing wrong with making money. And even in a collectivist society, we can still make money. We can still be successful. I think that the piece about it that goes beyond is can we do that while still being interdependent versus independent? Now, I don't want to finish until there's a question here from, I think it's Urke. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name. I apologize if I have not done it well. But what they're asking is, how do you inform and encourage other Indigenous people that it's okay and rewarding to have one's traditions, be Indigenous, and be in a 21st century world? Such a great question.
I don't, I guess I'm kind of working through that. I guess what I would do is I would say Indigenous people are a spiritual people. And so I think you can be a spiritual person and be connected to, teachings and tradition that have been passed down through millennia and be respectful of that and use that to guide your life. I think you can do that. And I think you can have the latest iPad and iPhone, and you can, do the modern things as well. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. And I guess to answer the question, how do you convince others that they don't have to totally convert or turn their back on a kind of the modern world? I guess my answer is connect, from a spiritual standpoint and history and tradition, and honor that. That's probably the best I have to answer that.
Yeah. I think this is such a deep conversation and such an important conversation. Here in Canada, we certainly are seeing lots of news around the ways in which, as a society, we've not respected our Indigenous hosts. And I really do see that, as a a European, my European lineage says that I'm a guest here on this land,
Mm.
and so I see that we haven't been good guests, and hope that we can do better in the future. I see we're coming up at the end of our show, so I do want to say thank you, Tim. You have provided us with such amazing things to speak about or to think about today, and also the work you're doing with Chandos. I know that you've just started, I think, an Indigenous project, have you not? Maybe as we
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. And to me, this is super cool. So, everyone heard my story. So we have last year we're awarded a project with the First Nations Technical Institute in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. So it's a $30 million roughly a mass timber net zero administration building for a post-secondary. We're using integrated project delivery, that highly collaborative model that I described as the delivery method, and it's in my home community. So I have an opportunity to give back and build something that'll be in that community for decades to come. So I'm super excited about that.
That's amazing. So, I mean, that brings us full circle, right?
Mhm.
The reality is, look, you can still be successful. You can be part of the community. You can give back, and you can have really interesting projects to work on that contribute money and funds to the organization and to the community. I mean,
Yeah.
there you go. Congratulations, Tim. You're doing great work in the world, and thank you so much for being part of today's talk.
Yeah, it's
And
great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
yeah, thanks so much. And thank you everyone who's joined us. That brings us to the end of today's show and our guest, Tim Coldwell. Join us next week where we speak with Dr. Drew Taylor, and we're going to be speaking on humans on demand. Drew is a regenerative medicine specialist and the chief executive officer of Acorn Biolabs. And we're looking at regenerative medicine, genetic engineering, and how sci-fi are shaping our future. So be sure to join us. It's going to be an interesting one. Until then, think about your community. Think about how you can play a role in creating a more collectivist approach to the work you're doing, to the communities that you're within, and even in how you view your own life. Because I think if we can find our way to be a little more to the collectivist mindset, we may find that some of the challenges that we have today start to go away. Thank you again and have a beautiful rest of your day.
See ya.